Hey there, Sheryl here. Before we jump in, I have a question for you. Have you ever found yourself in a predicament of really clamming up when you know, or when you really felt like you should have been speaking up? And I think it's safe to say that whether in our workplace or at home, maybe we've held back a little bit when we knew that we should be speaking up. Now, sometimes our gut and our heart tells us to do one thing, but the words just don't come out of our mouth. And the good news is it's 100% understandable, but the bad news is that there's some consequences of not doing so. Now I'm going to share a couple main reasons. The one is, let's go to the DE&I space, is that it's not, the reason why we're not making a lot of progress in this area, one of the reasons isn't because there are really awful people in the workplace that are just awful to their colleagues. A lot of time, and there are those people, but it's not the majority. What the research is showing is that roughly 80% of employees feel like they are advocates, that they are allies, but less than 50% of women of color feel like they're being supported, that like they have strong allies. So that's one area that's important to be aware of. The second area is when we feel like we want and need to speak up to our leadership. In other words, we have an idea. We know that maybe sometimes we're being challenged to do something that's against our highest sense of integrity, but we're afraid to speak up because there is a lot kind of on the line and we're kind of afraid of how that conversation is going to go. And so I want to shine some light on those two things, because it's problematic for our teams and our companies, but it's also problematic for us because there's what's called an emotional tax that gets paid. So in other words, when we are not speaking up for others and doing the right thing, or we're not speaking up for ourselves to our leadership, and we're not expressing what is in our highest sense of integrity, we pay what's called an emotional tax. And this emotional tax, which has been discovered in the research, a lot of it's done by the LeanIn.org, is that it makes it more likely that we're going to burn out. It is stressful when we feel silenced, by others, or when we're silencing ourselves. Okay, so I want to make sure this does not happen for you and it does not happen for your organization. And here's the thing, if you want to increase productivity and profitability and also the impact that you're going to have, it's really important to get this down because your voice matters a lot. Okay, and so this is really for a longer form workshop, but I want to make sure to get you started here. If you have any questions, you know how to find me by email, Sheryl@SherylKline.com, or if you have a specific situation that you want to talk through, go ahead and you can sign up for a strategy call at Sheryl@SherylKline.com/ignition. I almost forgot that for a second. So anyways, let's jump in. Where can you start? First is pay attention to your gut. Okay, there's a book by Gavin DeBecker called Gift of Fear. Talks about a lot of things, but one of the things he talks about is what a gut response is and why it's so important to pay attention to it. We tend to take in more information than we can process. So if you have senior leadership that's asking you to do something, but it's not within your highest sense of integrity, and you know in your core, you're getting a gut feeling about it, that you need to have a conversation. You need to have an influential conversation with your leadership because you know that you need to speak up and that you need to empower leadership to go a different direction, empower leadership to make the right choice. It's really important to raise your awareness of the gut feeling that you get. Also, what is your highest sense of integrity? Get very clear on both of those things. The second is make peace with whatever emotion you have around having this conversation or going into this meeting or challenging senior leadership. Maybe there's a lot at stake. Maybe it's scary. Maybe you're worried because you don't know how it's going to land. Maybe you're afraid that there's going to be pushback, what have you. In order to diffuse this, it's really important to acknowledge it and say, I'm really worried about this conversation. Okay, but here's the thing, world-class performers, you've probably heard me say this before, they have anger, fear, doubt, frustration, all of those things, but they proceed anyways. So it's really important to acknowledge whatever emotion you have in a very neutral tone. In other words, I'm worried about the outcome, or I'm fearful that there's going to be pushback when I have this conversation with my senior leader. And that's okay. It's in a very neutral tone. World-class performers proceed anyway. They make peace. So it's almost like you're saying to the emotion, I see you, I get that you're there, you're allowed to be in the room, but you need to be quiet because we're gonna do this anyway, okay? So raise awareness and make peace with whatever emotion you have around having that conversation with senior leadership, and so you can diffuse it a little bit. And finally, it's so vital, and a lot of people don't do this, but acknowledge and validate others' perspective. Even if it's someone, let's say it's a senior leader, they're asking you to do something that it is against your highest sense of integrity. You might really have opinions about it, but it is so vital to tee yourself up for influence that you acknowledge and validate their perspective. So in other words, it seems like, you know, growing revenue for this quarter is extremely important, and I get that 100%. But maybe they're asking you to do it in a way that is not within your highest sense of integrity, for example. But it's before you share your perspective about what your plan is, or what your ideas are, or what your thoughts are, it's extremely important to acknowledge and validate others. And it's the same thing if we're having that DE&I talk. You might pull someone aside privately and say, you know, it seems like there were a lot of emotions in that conversation, and I understand 100%. You know, here's, you know, what I heard. Does it make sense to maybe try and say that in another way, or something like that in a private conversation? So whether this can be applied to a DE&I conversation, it can be applied especially when you're speaking to senior leadership and you have an idea that you want to push forward, or you want to push back on an idea that's something that they're delivering down to you. So I hope that really makes sense. So you start to understand taking the first step in how to speak up when you know that you should. Start listening to your gut, start listening to your heart a little more. Take action on that, and just make sure to prepare for those conversations. Raise your awareness, make peace with the emotions, and then acknowledge and validate the other person's perspective, and then you should be well on your way. If you have any questions, excuse me, about this, or how you want to structure the conversation, that's a whole nother conversation. Be sure to reach out to me. I'm glad to support you any way I can. Keep on being amazing, and I'm cheering you on always.